let me give a little bit of introduction then, now that we've started. So the idea is to, I'm going to give you a talk for up to half an hour, depending on how things goes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. And really the purpose of tonight's talk is to introduce you to some of the camps that are lesser known, where internees were housed before they got to the Isle of Man. So I'm sure that many of you in the audience are familiar with the Isle of Man camps, and of course they were in existence for much longer. But there were a number of transit camps across the UK from the point of people's rest. And I have been asked in the past what sort of percentage of the number of internees that would have passed through. And because the Isle of Man camps weren't opened, the earliest ones were at the end of May. So the majority of people after their arrest before that point needed to be housed somewhere until the Isle of Man camps were ready. So there are very, very few people who were arrested. I mean, of course, we're talking about enemy aliens, most of whom were refugees from Nazi oppression. Very few of them would have gone directly to the Isle of Man. And those who would have gone quite quickly to the Isle of Man were B category women, but again, they still would have been held somewhere beforehand, mostly because the women's camp wasn't ready until the end of May as well. And with the category, Tony, do you want to mute yourself? With the category B arrests, there was still a gap between when they were arrested and actually when they could go to the Isle of Man. So it's highly likely, if you had a relative who was interned during the Second World War, they would have passed through one or more of these internment camps. And to give you an idea of how many, this isn't a complete list. This is a mostly complete list. I'm still working on that. But I'm going to show you a map that I've been working on, which gives you some indication of some of the camps. Okay, so these transit camps were around, and of course, if I were to zoom in on that, I may well show you the actual the map that I've created in Google Maps. There are many, many more in London than you can see. You might notice some different coloured arrows there. So black denotes prisons. So prisons are very much used as a holding area for, once arrests were made, you could hold a number of enemy aliens within the prison until they could be moved to a camp. There is, you can almost see it, it's just hiding in London, there's a little hint of pink, and the pink denotes Holloway prison, which is where women were sent to until suitable accommodation was made available on the Isle of Man. And then some of these orange and yellow, they denote some of the earliest camps. So let me give you a little bit of background. What happened was, when war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, and even a few days before that, MI5 had prepared multiple lists of people they thought would be a threat to national security if war was declared, and they knew war was coming. So they started rounding up, and they rounded up about 200 individuals, and these people were either demonstrably fascist or demonstrably communist. So you have quite a mix of people, including several refugees who were communists. They were rounded up, and also you had merchant seamen, because at this point in the war, merchant seamen were considered to be enemy alien civilians, whereas later on in the war they become classified as prisoners of war. So you end up in the early months of the war with up to 2,000 men who are interned, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the camps in a second. I just want to give you some sort of overview of actually sort of how this works. So you had these people who were arrested from MI5 lists, you had merchant seamen, and then you had another 600 men who were 600 men and women, sorry, there were some women in there as well, who were designated category A by tribunals. So I am talking about this as if I know many of you have heard me talk about these things before, so I haven't gone into huge amounts of depth, and I can obviously answer any questions you have later. But just to remind anybody who perhaps hasn't come across this history before, once war was declared, the British government was very aware that the majority of so-called enemy aliens, so you became an enemy alien if you were born in a country that that Britain was at war with, so Germans and Austrians at this point in time, they all went before tribunals so that the government, they didn't want to do mass internment like they had done during the First World War. They wanted to leave genuine refugees at liberty. They came up with this classification system whereby category A's were considered to be the biggest threat to national security, and therefore they were interned immediately. Category B, they weren't entirely sure about, and so they had some restrictions placed on their movements and what property they could own. And then category C was considered genuine refugee to Nazi oppression, and you could remain at liberty. So you had these three categories, and that prevented mass internment until much later in the war. So at this point, we're talking about the category A's and merchant seamen and anybody else who MI5 or the Secretary of State decided was a threat to national security. They could just be rounded up and they could be sent to camps. So this is very early on in the war. Now, these camps that I'm talking, say the early camps we can see are the oranges and the yellows, and also that little bit of pink that is hiding in London, as well as prisons temporarily. So one of the first camps that we had Olympia as a holding centre. So many people would be arrested in London and sent to Olympia. And they'd stay there for a few days, and then they'd be moved on to Clacton. So this is a photo, well, this is a postcard of the Butlins Clacton camp that was commandeered to be used for some of these very early internees. And holiday camps were the obvious choice because there was very little notice given of the upcoming internment. And what do you do in terms of housing large numbers of people? Well, holiday camps that are out of season seemed the obvious choice. So we also find that there's quite an interesting thing at this point in time. If you read some of the prison records, they do explain how actually there were considered two classes of internees, basically the wealthy and the not so wealthy. And so they divided the camp up into people who could pay for luxury and people who couldn't pay for luxury. So Clacton actually had two camps within it. They removed some of the chalets to put up a barbed wire perimeter fence with floodlights every few yards. But Clacton didn't actually stay in existence for too long. In terms of the living arrangements, the living conditions were not too bad. They weren't too crowded. You had two men assigned to each chalet, supplied with the bunks and blankets, and they had hot and cold running water. The food apparently was good according to some of the internees, if inadequate. So they never had too much, but of course they were stuck behind barbed wire. And as the weather started to change, as autumn progressed, you can imagine that the conditions in the camp weren't quite as good. You started to get, they called the paths quite swampy. They got very muddy, and it started to get a little colder. But by mid-October, they decided to close this camp completely and move everyone who was at Clacton across to Devon, where they did two camps. So these are on the left-hand side. You've got an example of Seaton holiday camp. It was a Warner's holiday camp. And on the right-hand side, you've got Dixon's camp in Paignton. Now, neither of these camps exist anymore. They have both been replaced by housing estates. But these pictures were taken in the 30s and 40s. So obviously these are not pictures of internees because no photography of the camps was allowed. So we have very limited information to patch together exactly what these camps were like. Now, the reason for 2 camps in Devon is because I was saying to you about the 2 classes of internee, A and B. And so Seaton was for ordinary internees and Paignton was for wealthy internees who could afford to pay 4 and 6 a day to actually have luxury accommodation, to have more space and to be less cramped, to get more food, and all sorts of things like that. So in terms of capacities, we're talking about the Warners camp in Seaton, which is just down the road from where I'm based. That held up to 650 men. And in the Paignton camp, that was only ever a maximum of 100. So you can already see that there's quite a difference in terms of crowding. But the problems you have here is you have a mixture of pro-Nazis and anti-Nazis in the same camp. And this led to a lot of conflict. In the end, in Seaton, this was worked out by the chalets were actually on either side of a swimming pool. And so one side became the fascist side and one side became the anti-fascist side. And if you couldn't quite decide which side you should be on, you pitched tents in the middle. So that was how they arranged that. And that's because you've got a mixture of merchant seamen and you've got a mixture of pro-communist Jewish refugees. Now, the problems that they had with this camp, particularly in Seaton, was it was a particularly harsh winter, the winter of 1939, and the chalets obviously are not designed for all year round use. So they were absolutely freezing. And you had real issues with the cold. The blankets were not sufficient. Eventually, the camp did decide, the camp authorities did say that they would look into alternatives, and they introduced some electric bar heaters until they realised how expensive it was to have all of the internees using electric bar heaters in their chalets. So they then tried to confiscate them, but the internees were quite good at hiding them. So they did manage to get some heat, but they had all sorts of problems, such as if there was a winter storm, the camp would sometimes get inundated with seawater because it's very close to the seafront. Now, in terms of what was happening, this is like a whistle-stop tour of some of the larger camps. In terms of what was happening with the women, this is an example of a cell in the 1930s in Holloway prison. Now, for the women, they were taken to prison. It wasn't considered that they could put women in some of the more harsh environments that they were putting some of the male internees. Harsh in terms of the weather rather than in terms of, obviously, it's quite a severe option to put women in prison. There were moves to try and get the women actually somewhere else rather than having them in a prison, as there were lots of complaints because, of course, you couldn't have your children with you if you were in prison. So actually there are quite a few examples of children having to be taken into care because their mothers were interned and potentially their fathers had been interned or weren't in the country. And so the prison service actually did look for an alternative, but they said it's very difficult to find a place to put 100 women that's going to have adequate facilities. They considered the Royal Victoria Patriotic Naval School at Wandsworth Common, that was too expensive. And they were also actually offered the Bishop's Palace in Southwark for free, but the prison commission said there's no way we could put people into there. Somebody's not muted. Apart from me, so getting some doorbell noises. They were offered the Bishop's Palace in Southwark for free, but the prison service, unfortunately, the heating is not good enough. There's no way we could put them in there because it wouldn't be fair to let them free. So actually, Holloway Prison was the main women's internment camp until the Russian camp was opened on the Isle of Man at the end of May. And then you start to see people being arrested, women sometimes with their children, and then they'd be transported for a day across the UK. They might be housed overnight in a disused school or a disused hospital. And then they would be put on the ferry across to the Isle of Man. So that's what's happening with the women. Now, we also have some other camps in existence. So this is a postcard from Lingfield racecourse, again from the 30s. This is not when it was an internment camp. This is just to give you a sense of the space. And again, here we have a mix of refugees and merchant seamen. And just to remind you in terms of the way that the arrests work, so I've talked about, we have up to 2,000 category A's and merchant seamen. And then what happens is the next sort of big, unless you are targeted by MI5, you remain at liberty until, if you're living on the eastern seaboard, so anything from on the eastern seaboard down from Scotland all the way across through Hampshire is designated as East Coast, and that becomes a protected area. And so you find that on the 12th of May, you have around 4,000 individuals arrested. Then on the 16th of May, the order's given, well, the order was given a couple of days before, but on the 16th of May, you start to see category B's, women and men, being arrested. So that's another 6,000. And there are 500 included in that. And then it's not until the 25th of June that the first wave of category C arrests come. So there's a big jump when we get to May in terms of who is being arrested and where are they going to put these people, because they've established these holiday camps in Devon and you've got Holloway prison. And clearly the capacity in these places is not nearly enough. You also have in existence at this time, before all of the big arrests, you also have Lingfield racecourse, and that also had this dual category. If you paid money, you could stay in the nicer part of the grandstand. If you didn't pay money, then you just got the standard grandstand buildings. And if we look at the description from December, they talk about the difference between the sailors who are quite destitute and some of the internees who actually have the money to get better accommodation. And then suddenly we jump to May, and Lingfield's actually been designated at this point as a specialised school camp for boys up to 18 who were merchant seamen. So they had their own separate quarters. And then there are also some people brought in from Iceland, some people brought down from Edinburgh, and 43 Jewish lads of 16 to 18 brought down from Edinburgh who were going to be transferred to another camp. So what I wish I could talk for longer about this, as I could indeed talk for longer about this. But just to give you the idea that with these transit camps, people are being moved around all the time. So some people might spend one night in a camp. Some people might spend a month in the camp. There's very transitory groups, and this is part of why the actual records of internment is very difficult to trace. It's very difficult to tell unless you have a relative who's written a diary that says, I was in Seaton from this date to this date, I was in Kempton Park from this date to this date, I was in Huyton from this date to this date. It can be quite difficult to piece it together. But through research that I've done and also with my husband, Alan, who will be talking next month, we have been able to sort of trace out some of the more common trajectories that people are sent on. So we have Seaton, Lingfield and Holloway all in existence. And then suddenly we start getting East Coast arrests. So anybody who was living on the East Coast who hadn't moved out of the protected area, regardless of your classification, if you were a foreigner living on the East Coast in part of what was designated the protected area, then you could be arrested. And at this point, the government starts thinking, we really need some more large spaces we can put people in, because this is another 4,000 on the 12th of May with a further 6,500 from the 16th of May. So within the space of a week, you're talking a very significant jump. Clacton, Seaton and Paignton, you may have noticed from the map, or you might be able to guess by the fact that their holiday camps are all by the sea, and they're actually really within the east. They're in the East Coast area. Seaton and Paignton do remain open, but as I mentioned earlier, Clacton does not. So holiday camps aren't necessarily going to be the only solution. They found Lingfield was quite successful as an option. So then they decided to use more racecourses. So you start to find that you've got Brighton Racecourse, not in existence anymore. Kempton Park was a major holding camp for people from the London area. That was a very large camp. You've got Southampton Racecourse. Sorry, Brighton Racecourse is still in existence. Sorry, I didn't mean that. I meant Southampton Racecourse, which no longer exists. And they're using the grandstands as very basic accommodation for people. So the nice thing about the racetracks is that you automatically have some outside space for the internees with the racetracks, and you've also got heated buildings in which to put the internees on. Now your accommodation is going to be very basic. You're going to be given a straw sack. You're going to be given a sack to fill up with straw to use as your mattress. And one thing that all of these camps have in common, because there's this mass influx of people, and the camp commandants don't always know how many people they're expecting, there's not normally a huge amount of food to go round. So something that is common in all of these transit camps, and this is by far the periods between arrest and arriving on the Isle of Man, if you were going to the Isle of Man, unless you went on a ship to Canada or Australia, your time on these British mainland camps was the worst part of internment by far, because you're talking about ill-equipped facilities, a lack of food, no real separation. In the early days, there was no separation of pro-Nazi and anti-Nazi. Once we get to May, by that point, they have separated many of the pro-Nazis and the anti-Nazis. So from Seaton, for example, as I was saying earlier about how you had the pro-Nazis on one side of the swimming pool and the anti-Nazis on the other, they actually did a shipment of pro-Nazis to another camp called Swanwick, which was so for pro-Nazis, so that they could actually sort of keep the anti-Nazis separate as well. So I mean, just to one description of Kempton Park by an internee said, quote, "Accommodation at Kempton Park was not too good. One had to sleep on mattresses on the concrete floors, no beds at all in the camp. Each internee received 2 blankets. Food at this camp was simply a disgrace. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 1 slice of bread with jam, no margarine, and a cup of some stuff called tea without sugar. At noon, there was cabbage soup and a small slice of dry bread. The internees were actually half-starved. Our group was lucky to leave so soon," end quote. Ludwig Spiro, in his interview, said, quote, "Totally unprepared on either side. Thankfully, weather was warm as it took a day or so to get a blanket," end quote. York Racecourse was also used if you were further up north, which is a very description. P. Lax described it as, quote, "It seemed to us like a paradise, as there were proper beds for everyone except the youth, who had straw sacks on the floor. Clean rooms, even if 60 to 90 people had to sleep in one room." That's great. So you've got this. So the race courses, at least there were heated buildings, but not always the most luxurious of surroundings. However, there are also a number of tented camps as well at this time. So here's an illustration by Wilhelm Jondorf of pre-seed. So you can see these large bell tents that they have in the background, and the description by, this is by actually a Quaker report from visiting the camp. They said the camp consisted of bell tents with marquees for dining and hospital purposes, and corrugated iron erections for kitchens. The equipment is new and good, but unfortunately a good many necessities had not yet arrived. Most serious of these shortages to the internees was that of palliasses and straw to fill them. The men were sleeping up to 7 in a tent on ground sheets. 3 blankets per man were provided, and a 4th had been promised. The open-air washing arrangements were rather primitive. A few shower baths were provided. The most unsatisfactory feature about the starting of this camp is that the men sent there include an unusually high proportion of elderly men. This is Sutton Coldfield. This is a very similar camp to this. On my recent visit to the other tent camp at Heath, which is where this illustration is from, I found that most of the men over 60 had been sent away with the idea that a tent camp did not provide suitable conditions for older men. But in Sutton Coldfield camp, I found about 700 men who had been brought here from Kempton Park and Lingfield camps, and they were mostly older men. And so one of the descriptions of Heath was saying about after sunset, utter darkness reigned in the camp, except for the brightly illuminated perimeter fence and occasional pale fluorescence of the moon. Fortunately, the summer of 1940 was exceptionally hot and dry. For the young and fit ones, conditions were therefore bearable or even enjoyable to a certain extent, but difficult for the rest. And again, there wasn't enough food in these camps. So there were these large tented camps, and they kept saying every time that there was a criticism made, conditions did improve in these camps when issues were raised in Parliament, but it still wasn't great, and yet they weren't meant to house anybody over the age of 50 because they did appreciate that this was not an ideal situation. However, it didn't stop them, especially in Sutton Coldfield, from actually doing that. In Heath, they did move everybody over 50 to other camps, which had actual physical hard-standing accommodation. However, as I'm sure many of you have heard about before, if you've come to talk about internment, this is Warth Mill, as was, and this was the worst by far of all of the camps. This was a disused mill with, as one of the internees, Helmut Weissenborn, he said, and I quote, "Water running through the building, sometimes almost inches in water with no drainage, about 12 taps for 2,000 people, hours waiting for food. The rooms were dark even in those sunny days of July, the floors soaked with the oil which for years had dripped from the looms, the staircases with an open lift shaft were very narrow, the corridors even narrower and damp. In case a fire was started by an incendiary bomb, not a single man would have escaped, and had a person forced his way into the open air, the space between the walls and the barbed wire would have been far too small. The hygienic accommodation was of a highly objectionable primitiveness. On the premises were, for about 2,000 people, 60 WCs, a euphemism, for there were just buckets spreading a terrific stench and no water flushing system." Now this particular camp was, most people were there for sort of less than a month. It wasn't, it was only open for around sort of 6 to 8 weeks, but a lot of people moved through on their way. This camp was based in Bury, just outside Manchester. So it was a camp where they were trying to move people up the country towards Liverpool. And so a lot of people stopped there. A lot of the people from the Arundel Star were housed on there because after Italy joined the war on the 10th of June, you start to see the arrest of Italians as well. So not only do we have Germans and Austrians now in internment, but we also have Italian men who were rounded up with no tribunals. There was no opportunity for them to explain that some of them had been living in the UK for over 20 years, some of them quite well established. So you've got Germans, Austrians and Italians now who are all being rounded up. And this was a really awful camp for those who were sent there. So when they went to Huyton, as many of them then did, this seemed like a luxury in comparison, not because Huyton was luxurious, but just because Warth Mills was so terrible. So with Huyton, you have an unfinished housing estate. It was pretty much finished, but none of the houses had been moved into, and it was in a place called Heath, just outside Liverpool. And they started arriving there from the 17th of May, 1940. And actually it comprised 3 camps within the overall Huyton camp. You had an Italian compound and you had a couple of other different compounds as well. And again, you hear things like the fact that there wasn't quite enough space for as many people who were put in to these camps. So the houses were filled up, and it was meant to be the older men went into the houses, and if you're younger men, then you had a tent in the garden, is how it worked. But there was very little coal available for the camp, for example, so you couldn't have any hot baths. If you were in the house or had shared use of the facilities, you could at least bathe inside instead of in some of the more rudimentary accommodation that you had in some of the tented camps and also some of the grandstands. You had about 170 beds for over 2,000 people. So again, we're talking about sacks stuffed with straw to give you as your mattress. It was really difficult if you lived in a tent to keep any of your belongings dry. There was lots of flooding. As Fred Kaufman wrote about his internment, and I quote, "Most of us were assigned 12 to a house, the remainder were put in tents, which leaked when it rained, as it did often. Human beings are adaptable creatures, and one quickly learns to make the best of what can be had. Cold showers, no soap and no towels. But at least we stayed clean, though clean clothes were quite another matter. I don't remember much about the food. It was uninteresting, but almost sufficient. And as for exercise, one could walk within the compound, and walk we did, though it was difficult with all the construction material that had been left on the site." End quote. I mean, Henry Mendel said about his time in Huyton, quote, "3 times a day we had our meals, which were on the whole rather poor and inadequate. In the morning we had tea, which did not taste good, jam and margarine in quite insufficient quantities. The same went for bread. Sometimes there was coffee, which was actually quite drinkable at times. The midday ration was extremely scarce, and I often felt hungry all day long. I also feel this explains that I continually felt sleepy in a way I'd never known before. I often slept for 2 hours in the morning and likewise in the afternoon. Any time remaining was spent moaning to one another." End quote. With Huyton, these are not all of the camps in any way. As you saw with the map, there are an awful lot of these camps about the place. These are some of the main ones that most people moved through at some point. Huyton was by far the largest of all of these internment camps on the British mainland, and it was designed as a transit camp to house people before they were put on the boats from Liverpool, either to the Isle of Man or to Canada or Australia on the transports abroad. So Huyton's by far the biggest, but I hope in this incredibly whistle-stop tour, I will just put this up, so in case you want to get in touch with me, you can use some of that information. This is a whistle-stop tour of some of the camps, just to give you an idea of some of the places that the internees actually ended up prior to their time in the more permanent camps on the Isle of Man and in Canada and in Australia. And so there are a huge variety of camps, huge variety of experience, and this by far was the worst part of internment for many, unless they were sent abroad, because obviously the conditions on ships was terrible. If they ended up on the Isle of Man, their time before that was not a particularly pleasant one, going through all these transit camps. And it was very much potluck as to where you got assigned. And they would have been moved quite a lot of times, and there's a lot of transience in the groups until they ended up in the more permanent camps on the Isle of Man. So I will say thank you very much for now, and I think we'd better move on to some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. Very interesting. I certainly have learned quite a bit since I didn't know this. All I knew was that my parents were interned on the Isle of Man for about a year, and so I don't know whether I presume they were in these interim camps as well, but I have no evidence to that, and the letters didn't say anything about that. So I've got several questions, some from me, but I'll ask first from Celia Frank. she said, how important were factors such as having a business or being an employer or moving out of London, say to Wales, in terms of avoiding internment?
Yeah, which is a brilliant question. So again, Alan and I have been doing some research together on the people who weren't interned, which actually is a quite surprisingly large number. So if you were within, if you're category A, obviously you're interned. If you're category B, you're interned. If you were living on the East Coast, you were interned. And then the idea was to intern all category C men. So all category C women remained at liberty, but category C men were to be interned. And they estimated that there were maybe the British government estimated there were maybe around 25,000 category C men who were going to be rounded up. Through some research that Alan and I have done, we've discovered that around 10,000 of those 25, if the 25 is correct, we still have to confirm that, but around 10,000 category C men were not interned, which is higher than one might think. And the main reason for this is because they ran out of space in the camps. And so with the category C arrests, they went in 3 phases. And it did very much depend on if you were unemployed or a student, then you were in the first wave of getting rounded up because they didn't want you to become a charge on the rate. Also, I should probably mention that if you were a teenager who turned 16 during this time, you were automatically categorised as B and interned. Which and again, quite a bit of that is to do with worrying about them becoming a charge on the rates and not knowing what to do with them. So they thought they'd be safer off in cap. So if you were unemployed, you would have got rounded up. If you're most likely to not have been interned if you're actually in London, interestingly enough, because they ran out of space. And so if you were employed in London and had managed to avoid the first 2 waves of arrests, then there is a high probability that you wouldn't get interned at all because there was no space to put anybody. So the Metropolitan Division stopped arresting people. And then by that point, the tide had turned against the idea of mass internment. So it was decided to just leave people at liberty. So if you were running a company or you were employed in important work, then you could remain at liberty. And certainly almost 10,000 category C men did remain at liberty for the duration of the war.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Let me move on to some thoughts and questions from myself. First of all, all I know is the letters that my mother kept from my father, and they were just while they were on the Isle of Man. So I don't know about any internment prior to that. The one thing I'll point out, my mother was in the Huyton camp. Men and women were separated. My mother had to sleep for a couple months, share a bed with a woman who was a Nazi. So people are aware of that, and that was a very uncomfortable situation for her. And she finally was able to change bedmates, so that she was very relieved about that. So do you have any information how many went directly to the Isle of Man and didn't go through any of the intermediate camps?
So as I was saying before, people all went through intermediate camps, even if it was just for 1 night or 2 nights. Women had to be transported up to the Isle of Man. So if you're you definitely went at least one of these intermediate camps. If you're a woman, it's possible they may have transported you on the same day, but only once the Isle of Man camp was open. So you're going to be going through a disused hospital or a disused school, something like that. Because Russian camp, as you say, as I was saying about the men, eventually they'd separated the anti-Nazis from the pro-Nazis. So Russian camp, which was the women's camp on the Isle of Man, they didn't separate them out. Eventually, after the first couple of months, it became sorted out so that you had Nazi houses and then non-Nazi houses within there as well. I did see Jeanette's question, which I think links quite nicely to that. So I was saying that 500 children were rounded up, around 500 children were rounded up with their mothers in the category B arrest. Now for Holloway prison, you're quite right. I did say no children were allowed there. So they were either, the children were either in that case sent into care or put into the care of relatives. Once they got to the Isle of Man, that's if they went through Holloway prison. If they didn't go through Holloway prison, then there was no separation of women and children. And so they went to the Isle of Man, where the women and children remained in Russian camp. So they were kept all together. So it was only category A's where the women and children were separated. It was only the category A's who were in Holloway prison. Otherwise, the children mostly were taken with their mothers and then sent on to the Isle of Man.
Okay.
So that's why we have up to, there are around 500 children who were interned on the Isle of Man in the Russian camp.
Right. So Diana da Costa asks, is it possible that some of the people interned went from London to Kempton Park rather than Lingfield?
There are many people who went from London to Kempton Park. It didn't, just because you were from London, didn't guarantee that you'd end up in Kempton Park. Some of the decisions made were quite strange in some ways. You had some people directly from London down to Devon for 2 days and then moved up north. But there are many people who were in London who were sent via Kempton Park, yes. Some of them would have still gone via other camps as well.
Okay, let's see. Jeanette asked about children. My mom
so that's what we were just
was born in April 1936 and was interned with her grandmother.
Yes, so I just answered that question.
Okay. Oh,
and we can see some more family. So yeah, so you had about around 3,000 women and around 500 children in Russian camp on the Isle of Man. And for the very young children, because the women's camp was set up very differently. So the men's camps were just accommodation surrounded by barbed wire, and the women's camp was 2 towns surrounded by barbed wire. So you were free to wander within the town. So you could go to the beach, you could go to the cinema. So many of the young children who were interned remember it as being some sort of holiday, because they could run around and do what they wanted and explore, so long as they stayed within the confines of the camp. It's a very different atmosphere to that of the men's camps.
So how long were they typically in these temporary camps before they ended up in a permanent camp?
So that depended on when they were arrested. So if you think the earliest camps opened on the Isle of Man at the very end of May 1940. The arrests for so ignore if you were category A or a merchant seaman, then you'd been interned potentially from September 39. If you were East Coast, you got arrested on the 12th of May, around then. If you were category B male, that was the 16th of May. Women were arrested on the 28th of May, which is why women in the B category could go straight to the Isle of Man, sometimes via somewhere else, so they could collect more people together for a transport. So there were a lot of stories of women and children staying overnight somewhere before going on to the Isle of Man. And then category C arrests start from the 25th of June. So even because not all the camps are ready at this point, so you've got 2 camps ready at the end of May. You've got Russian camp for women, and you've got Morag camp, which is on the north of the Isle of Man. for men. Now you have to wait another couple of weeks before you get the next 2 camps opening on the Isle of Man, which were Central and Onchan, and then another few weeks before even more of the male camps open up. So this means that even if you are arrested as a C category on the 25th of June, you still wouldn't have ended up automatically on the Isle of Man. You still would have gone through transit camps. So most people went through transit camps for it's normally sort of around 6 to 8 weeks that they'd been. I mean, some people were in there for less time, particularly if you're a C, you might have managed to get away with sort of only a few weeks. But if you were arrested early on, you're looking at most people will have been at least 4 weeks moving around, unless you're a woman, and then you would have gone straight to the Isle of Man from the 28th of May.